Hello, welcome back to Let's Talk Title with Emerald Coast Title Services. I'm President and host Dion Moniz.
And I'm Ashley Bowen, the Director of Operations and a licensed title agent, and also an instructor for Florida Realtors.
Yes, I love that last part.
Yay!
That's awesome. So today we're going to go over the revisions to the FARBA contract. They actually made in December of 2024, but we were so busy doing our contract series that we didn't get a chance to cover this, so we're going to do it now.
But they are very important changes that have already started to cause some questions on the closing statement.
Yep. So we're going to let you know what those changes were. There's not a lot of them, but they do make an impact, especially on the closing statement. So Ashley, why don't we kick off with the first one?
Okay, so the first change you are going to find in Section 9 in the closing cost section. Under both the buyer and the seller's closing costs, there's now a line item for closing services. The seller has to pay for the seller's closing services, and the buyer now has to pay for the buyer's closing services. Now that is different than how it used to be, because you used to choose either the seller or the buyer shall designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges, and that included closing services.
Yep.
But now they've separated it. And
Right.
so now you are choosing either the buyer or the seller is going to pay for the owner's title insurance policy, but each party has to pay for their own closing services, it says.
Yeah, and we think this came around because of the way South Florida handles their closings, where literally each side hires their own attorney to handle the buyer side and seller side, and so they have their own attorney's fees that are considered closing services. And so, plus then you have the escrow agent. So we're pretty sure this is put in here to make South Florida happy. It's not how we do it in North Florida.
No, and it does not make us happy because so it goes on to define in big, bold print.
Yep.
Closing services shall have the meaning ascribed to the term in this section of the Florida statutes. It's section 627.7711. Each party shall pay their own closing services and fees payable to closing agent or other such providers as each party may select. So that's kind of hairy. So if the title company is going to charge a closing fee on both sides of the transaction, and say the party who's not paying title doesn't want to pay that fee, they can then go to another provider to handle their closing portion. I don't know. I feel like it's going to make...
Well, again, it's like in South Florida where each side has their own lawyer.
And that's fine.
To draft docs and all that.
Down
and that's
there.
their side of the closing services. I don't see that happening up here. But it's in the contract now. And so the boldface language for our listeners that Ashley was talking about is at lines 184 to 187, or I'm sorry, 184 to 186 on the FARBAR contract on page 4, just so you know what we're talking about. But why don't you if you want, you can get the definition in the statute, and then we'll discuss a war story that we just heard about.
The statute defines closing services as services performed by a licensed title insurer, title agent, or agency, or an attorney agent, including but not limited to preparing the documents necessary for closing, conducting the closing, and handling the disbursement of funds related to the closing. So I feel like those closing services are done for both parties. We handle the disbursement of funds for both parties. We prepare documents for both parties, and we conduct closing appointments with both parties. So it could be argued that it could be a fee charged to both sides. However, I have gotten some kickback from it. From charging it on both sides.
So when these changes came out, we said, all right, we'll just take our typical closing fee and split it down the middle. That must be what this is, the intent. Mm-hmm. But go ahead and talk about the feedback or the kickback that you've been getting.
Well, so we have had feedback from, say the buyer's paying for all the closing, it's supposed to be paying for the closing fee, and then there was a fee on the seller side, and the listing agent said, hey, why are we getting charged that? The buyer needs to be paying for the closing fee. And so then we had to have a discussion, and then everybody came with a mutual agreement that in this situation the buyer was going to pay for that entire settlement fee. Now, you and I had a discussion with a lender earlier this week, and the lender had issue with the buyer getting charged a closing fee when the seller was supposed to be paying for the title fees, because whenever he did his loan estimate, he estimated that the seller was paying for everything, and so didn't put an estimate for a closing fee on the buyer side. And then once they got the CD, there was this big $400 fee, and the lender had to pay it. They had to. It wasn't curable or what have you.
Yeah.
And so that is a sticky situation if you've got, a buyer who cannot pay closing costs. They only have so much money to buy the house. They've asked the seller to pay title, but then you get stuck with this closing fee that you weren't expecting. And so you suggested some language be put into the contract to avoid that from happening.
Yeah, so essentially, if the intent is to do it the old way, for North Florida at least, where the party that's paying title is also paying the closing fee or the closing services, as the term is now used, then, for instance, if you're going to shift it to seller, typically Okaloosa Walton, buyer pays title, right? But if you're going to shift that and have seller pay title, then what you would want to do is under Section 9, really what you need to do is at line 142 for other, you want to write see additional terms. And then at line 170, under the buyer costs, next to other, you want to say see additional terms. If you can, on buyer side, you'll scratch out buyer's closing services and initial. Some agents say they can't do that. Their brokers don't like language being scratched out, but you at least want to put see additional terms on both of the other categories under 9A and 9B, and then you want to go to the additional terms and say seller shall pay for all title premiums and closing services, period.
That will have the seller pay for both the lenders and the buyer's premiums.
Right.
If you wanted the seller to just pay the owner's policy, and let the buyer pay for their lender's policy, then you could just say seller to pay for buyer's closing services.
Yes,
or
exactly.
all closing services.
Yeah. So depending on what the intent is, as far as who's paying title, whether it's both premiums or just owners versus lenders, and then closing services, if the intent is to switch those closing services to another side and have one side pay all of it, then you need that additional language. And again, if you want one side to pay all of the title premiums, well, I guess seller, because typically buyer is always going to pay for the lender's policy. So if you're trying to get seller to pay title, meaning buyer's policy and lender's policy, then you want to make that notation as well. Otherwise, you're going to have a conflict with the standard language in the contract, and that's going to be a problem.
So this is important, I think, for your lender
Yeah.
and for your buyer who is short on money. And if you don't use that language and you do have a lender, if lenders are listening, get your draft CD from the settlement agent early so you know if they're going to be charging a settlement fee on both sides.
And another interesting thing is there is not a limit on what the closing services can be charged. So some title companies might increase their fee now that they know they can split it down the middle and charge it on both sides. And so that's something else you want to be aware of. You want to get that draft settlement statement from your closing company and see what the closing services are going to be charged on either side, so you can negotiate that ahead of time before you go under contract.
I completely agree. The FLTA, which is the Florida Land Title Association, put a bulletin out in the middle of January after this contract change came out. And they told us that this is not just a blank check, but I have a feeling that not all title companies read that bulletin, and they are going to be using this as a blank check to get paid whatever they want on both sides.
Yeah, it'll happen. Mm-hmm. So be mindful. Now, at least now you know whether you're on buyer or seller side, depending on what you're trying to negotiate. Just understand now that there are closing services on both sides that need to be taken into account, and also be mindful of the title premium. Or is your client going to pay owner's policy, owner's and lender's policy, what have you. All right.
Okay.
I feel like we covered that one pretty well.
Yeah,
what's the next one?
I think that was pretty good. So the other thing that was changed in this was just in the default section. There was language in the contract that stated that if the buyer were to default, then both of the brokers could get some of the earnest money. But now that language has been removed. If the buyer defaults and the realtor wants to get paid, then the BBA covers.
Yeah, and that's what the BBA is intended for. We did an episode on the BBA, but just remember that once the property goes under contract, the commission is deemed earned. And then it clearly says in the BBA that if the buyer defaults and doesn't close, the agent is still owed that commission. So yes, so now the agent has a direct cause of action against the buyer because of their contract versus having to rely on language in the contract to which the agent is not a party.
So buyer gets to lose the EMD to the seller
and owe the commission.
And owe the commission to the buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the teeth are a lot sharper now for buyer defaults.
They sure are. So that was a good change.
Yep.
And then the last change of this New Year's Eve 2024 update to the FAR bar contract was in the section 19 in the addenda. They just added boxes for your writers FF and GG, your new best friends. FF should be your new best friend. I hope that
FF is your friend.
Yes, I hope that everybody is using their FF, credit related to buyer's broker compensation, writer on every contract that is a FAR bar. And if you have a CRISP contract, if you are still using the CRISP contract, which we
shame on you.
We don't recommend, but if you are, then they also have a writer, and its abbreviations are CARB, like carbohydrate. CARB 1, I think is what it is, and that is the writer that you would use to add your compensation to contract on a CRISP contract.
Yeah, it's essentially the same as FF, just for CRISP.
Yes.
Because you don't want to cross-pollinate contracts and writers.
No, and for any of your writers and contracts, always look at the very bottom of the writer and make sure that it matches the contract that you're attaching it to.
Yep.
But we have still heard some questions about these compensations and the FFGG, the old seller to buyer broker compensation agreements and all of that. We suggest FF.
Yeah, and if you're wondering what the heck we're talking about with FF or GG, just go and look at our prior podcast episode because we talk all about it.
Yes, it's a good idea.
All right, and the last change is?
So they also updated every single writer to the contract, but I didn't really see any changes to them. But they just updated them all and stuck them all in form simplicity for you all.
The minimal changes for the most part.
Yes, but the condo writer did have a pretty significant change. And that the condo writer, it's writer A to the FAR bar contract. They have added that a turnover inspection report has to be completed and given to the buyer if the association has or has not completed the turnover inspection report. Last year when they updated, or maybe it was 2 years ago, the last time they updated the condo writer, where they had to add the information about the milestone inspections and the SIRS, where the buyer had to acknowledge either receiving those reports or the association hasn't done those reports. Now they've added this turnover inspection report language to it. And when the condo writer first came out, I didn't know what the heck that was. So I had to go talk to our association attorneys and ask, what is that? And so I found out that the turnover report is what happens when the developer turns the management of the condo over to the association.
Right.
And in July of 23, they added to the Florida statute that the SIRS report that all had to be included in that turnover report that is turned over to the association. And so the condo writer says that if they are required to have this turnover inspection report, then you have to include it. But no condo that the association, or that the association was turned over from the developer to the association before 2023 will have this language in it because the statutes changed in 2023. So you don't even have to worry about this thing unless you have like a brand new condo.
Gotcha. Yeah, and Ashley is referencing the new section 10B, as in boy, under the condo rider, which is where this turnover inspection report is now referenced. And just to clarify, it's the turnover from the developer to the owners as far as management of the association. You said owners to the association, developer to the association, but it's when the owners take control. The association is always going to be managed by a board, but it goes, because initially when the developer starts the project, it's all controlled by the developer. And
until a certain time, depending
after so
on
many lots are sold off, then the developer has to turn over control to the association/owners. Yeah.
So that section 10B, y'all don't really have to worry about it unless it's a new condo. So for the majority of the condos here, your answer there is going to be 10B2.
Yeah.
Where it's not required.
And because it even references the date after July 1, 2023. So that box is going to be checked, not required, if the condo is prior to that July 1, 23, right?
Right. So I had to do some research, and luckily I've got a great group of people that I can go to and ask these questions to, but I figured that most everybody would know what that turnover inspection report was, so wanted to mention it here today.
Good stuff.
So now everybody knows.
And I think what we'll do is we're going to dedicate one of our podcast episodes to how to read
a SIRS report?
That and the association budget to figure out whether there's proper reserves, etc.
How to read an association budget.
Yeah.
That sounds exciting.
That'll definitely be one for bedtime listening to help you get to sleep at night. All right, well, I think we've covered all the December 2024 updates. Like I said, we wanted to get to you as soon as we could once our contract series was done, so hopefully you learned a little bit off that. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. You can find us on all our social media channels or ects.com. And in the meantime, we'll catch you later. Bye.